Oi, it's time for my DCS Warbirds update for October 2020. Biggest item first then, the damage model. In my video at the end of September, I said that the damage model was slated for release at the end of October. No surprise, that deadline has been missed. Current information from the guys at Eagle Dynamics is that we might get something for the first patch of November, which should be November 4th. So will we see that new damage model in a couple of days? I really don't know. All I can do is hope for the best. And if we don't get it, then I'll just cry a little bit more. Also, in other interesting news, perhaps unexpected news, the Mosquito is now apparently going to be released before the end of the year. If I was honest with you, I would say that we won't see this for 2 years yet. I'm incredibly surprised to hear that Eagle Dynamics are claiming publicly that they plan to release this inside 2020. This is incredibly good news. Now, this information comes from a video that was put together by FastJet Performance YouTube channel where they interviewed Simon from Eagle Dynamics. I'm going to skip to that video and discuss some of that video content in more detail shortly. I just wanted to highlight this Mosquito issue first up because it surprised me somewhat, and I think it surprised quite a few people that this timeline is now so near. As of the past week or so, there is now a brand new World War II server up on DCS. The server is called the Clash of Wings, and it's been set up by one of the established World War II groups, the 362nd, who are based out of the United States. So that is also where the server will be based. The server is designed to provide a more accessible path into DCS World War II from the current popular servers, namely Storm of War and LFDM. And I'm going to explain now why I refer to it as being more accessible. Currently, in order to fly on one of the popular World War II servers such as Storm of War or LFDM, you are going to need to not only own the aircraft module that you wish to fly, but also you'll need the World War II assets pack and one of the two, or potentially both, of the two dedicated World War II maps. Now, this can present quite the financial barrier, especially for someone who's just wanting to dabble a bit to test out World War II online. And if you add up that 4 or 5 modules you need, it could be upwards of $100 US. So the guys from 362 have set up the server. All you will need is the aircraft module you wish to fly. The server runs on the free Caucasus map, and the World War II assets pack is not required. Furthermore, they've added a couple of pilot aids, such as the labels or the black dot labels mod, which makes spotting easier and a bit more simple than the vanilla DCS without that mod. The goal of the server is to expand the existing World War II player base and to provide a pathway for people to have a look at it and then potentially move on to what they refer to as the more advanced servers like Storm of War and LFDM. The Clash of Wings guys do have a Discord. I will provide the link to the Discord in the description to this video if you want to go visit them. And if you're interested in DCS World War II online, but you're a bit put off by the costs of entry, this may be the perfect way to dabble. Let's return now to that FastJet Performance video interview. The video I'm talking about, I'll provide a link to in the description below. It's on the FastJet Performance channel, and it's an interview which came out on the 22nd of October with Simon Pearson, who's in the marketing side of Eagle Dynamics. The content is mostly jets related, as you would expect based on the FastJet Performance channel. However, Simon seems to have a pretty solid interest in the Warbirds himself and did respond to a couple of viewer questions about DCS World War II. So that's what I want to focus on here. So Simon says quite early on that if Eagle Dynamics were to do the World War II project over from the beginning, that they would start with the Battle of Britain rather than starting with the late war aircraft that they did, which was the K4 and the D9. I'm not sure if Simon is saying that if they were to go back in time to when they initially proposed doing DCS World War II, that they would have or should have done Battle of Britain then, or if he's saying that if they were to start now, they would start with Battle of Britain. And I think that timing distinction matters. Because if you take the clock back to when Eagle Dynamics first released the K4, this was right about the period when IL-2 Cliffs of Dover was the predominant online multiplayer game for World War II. IL-2 in its kind of original form was starting to come to the end of its popularity, and IL-2 Great Battles was not yet a commercial product. And Cliffs of Dover was set in the Battle of Britain, and it was a very, very good game for its day once its fundamental bugs had been fixed. I think that DCS would have severely struggled against Cliffs of Dover had they tried to compete directly with it back in 2015, 2016. However, that said, Battle of Britain does actually present some opportunities for a flight sim developer that may make it a lot easier than a number of other theatres. And the reason is because the Battle of Britain was exclusively aerial combat. There is no real need for large numbers of ground units in the form of an assets pack to go along with it. You basically go with the base map. You would need naval units, particularly the smaller naval units which were ferrying goods up and down the channel. And then you could focus primarily on aircraft, that is both flyable aircraft and AI aircraft. There would be a need for some flat guns, but on the ground unit side, there would not be the kind of demand that you have with a Normandy scenario where the ground war was of primary importance. I'm not sure if Simon just gets a little bit tongue-tied in his follow-up statement about the specific aircraft that they would develop, but it seems to me that he's suggesting that the G6 of the 109s would belong with the Spitfire and the Spitfire 2 and the Hurricane in a Battle of Britain scenario. Obviously, the G6 is a mid to late war aircraft, and there were no G6s flying during the Battle of Britain, so that doesn't make too much sense. One of the problems with the Battle of Britain is that not only do you have the Spitfire 1 and the 2, but within the Spitfire 1 and 2, and the 1 in particular, there are a number of very, very important sub-variants. This was a time when the fuel was switching over from the 80 to the 100 octane. It's also a time when the prop assemblies were going through significant changes from the fixed to the constant speed props. And this applies to the Hurricane as well. So to accurately model even the Spitfires, which Simon seems to think would be a matter of the 1 and 2, is not really very a simple job. Then if you look across the channel at the German side, you have the E1, the E3, the E4 and the E4N all in service just of the BF109 variants, and there are significant differences between these variants. They are not simply minor changes. They definitely influence the way you fly and fight in those aircraft. On top of that, let's also not forget that a significant proportion of the Battle of Britain was really about the German medium bomber effort. And I think that in order to accurately represent the Battle of Britain, you really need to be able to have flyable medium bombers, at a minimum the Ju-88, the Do-17 and the Heinkel 111. To date, Eagle Dynamics have not been able to produce a flyable twin-engined World War II aircraft, although the Mosquito is apparently just around the corner. On top of that, if you think about adding multi-crew in with potentially multiple stations per aircraft, as has been modelled in the likes of Cliffs of Dover, then things start looking rather steep as a task indeed for something like DCS. My opinion is that chasing Battle of Britain is probably a step too far for Eagle Dynamics. I think it would end up being a bit of a distraction, and I don't think we would end up really with a plane set and all the assets that would make it worthwhile. My advice to them would be just to stick with late 1943, early 1944. It's already a path that they've made a lot of strides on, and there is still a lot of, shall I say, money to be made from focusing on fleshing out that mid to late war plane set. We now know that the Pacific is being worked on as well, and we'll discuss some of the comments on the Pacific a bit later on. So I think Battle of Britain is not only a long way away, but I think this constant suggestion that Eagle Dynamics is going to go to the Battle of Britain period is more worrying than it is encouraging. Simon then talks about the problems of trying to juggle historical demand versus gamer demand for Eagle Dynamics, and he uses the example of someone perhaps coming from War Thunder. There's also a comment here about how many people care about whether they have a Spitfire 2 or a Spitfire 9, and how many people know the difference, in fact, between those variants, let alone something like a Spitfire 14. This is where I want to just put some more thoughts into this of my own. I suspect that a lot of people who I play DCS World War II with share the same kind of thinking I do. However, we may be in a minority, in which case our opinion from a strictly commercial sense is probably not worth a lot. However, I'm going to give my opinion anyway because it's my YouTube channel and that's what I do. There is a big difference between an aircraft like the Spitfire 2 and the Spitfire 9 if you are taking them in their historical context. If I'm given a Spitfire 2, I do not expect to be matched up against the F-14 Tomcat or the F-5 Tiger or the F-4 Phantom or the F-86 Sabre or the 109 K4 or the 109 G6 for that matter. If I'm flying the Spitfire 2 and it's a high fidelity simulation and there is a combat component to that, then I expect to be fighting against cohort aircraft such as the 109 E7, possibly the early F Foxtrot variants of the 109, and also the likes of the E4, the E4N of the 109s. That kind of cohort, late 1940, early mid-1941. Same goes for the Spitfire 9. If I'm flying the Spitfire 9 with the 61 or the 66 Merlin engines, then we're looking at 43, late 43, early 44. It's not that people don't care whether they have the Spitfire 2 or the Spitfire 9. People care about the matchup. And if you were just building a sim that was simply about modeling vintage aircraft, and you were just going to be flying them in the modern context, taking off from an aerodrome, doing an air show, flying them around to see what it's like to fly a vintage aircraft, then it doesn't really matter. Model the Spitfire 2, model the Spitfire 9, model the F-86 Sabre. Just have a series of aircraft which you have in your hangar, kind of similar to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. You're just flying them around for the joy of the aircraft. But DCS is not that. Well, DCS does not market itself to be that. DCS markets itself as a combat simulator, and that is where the matchups matter. Not only do the matchups matter, but the maps matter, and the historical setting of all the ancillary stuff matters too, such as the anti-aircraft, such as the radar, such as the fighter controlling and the radios. All of that stuff is part of this combat simulation package. And I think for me, some of Simon's words here start muddling that line. If DCS is struggling, if Eagle Dynamics are struggling to understand the historical versus the gamer demand, then they really need to have a very, very deep think about whether they really want to be a combat flight simulator as opposed to a aircraft study simulator. And I think there is a difference, and I don't think I'm the first person to talk about this either. So yes, there is a big difference between the Spitfire 2 and the Spitfire 9. I certainly care, and it certainly matters to me in the context of combat simulation. Simon alludes then to the increasing focus that Eagle Dynamics appear to be placing on the Pacific theatre. We already know the Marianas map is underway. We know that there is a third party developing the course air, and I'm hoping that we are going to see assets, other flyable aircraft, and plenty of AI assets up in the air to fit that as well. However, I'm a little concerned once again about what time period we're going to see in that Pacific theatre. Somewhat concerningly, Simon mentions the Akagi as the Japanese carrier they're looking at adding to the Pacific. The carrier Akagi was scuttled after taking heavy damage in 1942, mid-late 1942. That means that carrier belongs to an early Pacific assets, navies, and aircraft set, not a mid-late war one. So already I'm starting to scratch my head a little and wondering whether we're going to get a similarly disparate mishmash of Pacific assets that don't belong together. I would highly advise Eagle Dynamics at this early stage to think about the assets you're going to build. If you are going for a Marianas Guam scenario in the Pacific, if that's where the action is being based, then you need to build the assets, the aircraft, the naval stuff around the battles that occurred over and near those islands and when those battles occurred. Otherwise, you will end up in a similar situation to what you were when you first released the Normandy map, that everything was disparate and didn't really work well together, and for some respects still doesn't. So I would really urge caution there for the development to focus on historicity, and if you're already settled on the Marianas, then use that as your timestamp. That just about wraps up the update for October. Just while we're on the subject of maps, Dietrich wrote an article recently on the SoW Magazine explaining why the channel map is not being used for the foreseeable future on the server, and I'll put a link to that just below for anyone who wants to have a little read. Thanks for watching as usual, everyone. Fingers crossed for the 4th of November that we get this new DM. Otherwise, as usual, I'll see you up there.